Welcome to Imagine Otherwise, the podcast about the people and projects bridging art, activism, and academia to build better worlds. Episodes offer in-depth interviews with creators who use culture for social justice and explore the nitty-gritty work of imagining otherwise. I'm your host, Cathy Hannabach. This episode is sponsored by the MA in Critical Studies program at the Pacific Northwest College of Art. The Critical Studies program produces creative, critical thinkers with the research, writing, and communication skills necessary to address pressing issues at the intersection of cultural production and critical theory. MA program applications are open now, and for more information, you can go to pnca.edu/critical studies. This is episode 80, and my guest today is Kēhaulani Kauanui. Kēhaulani is a professor of American Studies and affiliate faculty of anthropology at Wesleyan University, where she teaches courses related to Indigenous studies, critical race studies, settler colonial studies, and anarchist studies. She's the chair of American Studies, as well as the director of the Center for the Americas. Her books include Paradoxes of Hawaiian Sovereignty, Land, Sex, and the Colonial Politics of State Nationalism, published in 2018 by Duke University Press, Speaking of Indigenous Politics, Conversations with Activists, Scholars, and Tribal Leaders, published in 2018 by the University of Minnesota Press, and Hawaiian Blood, Colonialism and the Politics of Sovereignty and Indigeneity, published also by Duke University Press in 2008. Kēhaulani serves as a co-producer for an anarchist politics show called Anarchy on the Air, a majority people of color show co-produced with a group of Wesleyan students, which builds on her earlier work on another collaborative anarchist program called Horizontal Power Hour. Kēhaulani is one of the original 6 co-founders of the Native American and Indigenous Studies Association, which was founded in 2008. In our interview, Kēhaulani and I chat about the histories and futures of the Hawaiian sovereignty movement, why independent media is uniquely suited to telling Indigenous stories, the solidarities between anarchist and Indigenous movements, and how putting consent politics front and center is key to how she imagines otherwise. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Mahalo. Thank you for having me on the show. I'm excited to be in conversation with you.
So I would like to start talking about one of 2 very recent books that you have come out, and I'm hoping to talk about both. But let's start off by talking about the one that originally started out as a radio show, Speaking of Indigenous Politics. And that book collects a large number of interviews that you had done over the course of years in that radio show. I'm curious about that process of translating something from audio form to book form. What was that like?
Oh, yeah. Thank you for asking. I'm really excited about this book. So for context for your listeners, I produced alone and hosted a show called Indigenous Politics from Native New England and Beyond through the studios of WESU Middletown in Connecticut. That show launched in February 2007 and was on air through 2013. There were over 200 people featured on the show in that time. And for most of the people that were on the program, I did conduct interviews. There were some where there were lectures that I had attended and aired the lecture because the lecture was so open in terms of a general listening audience. So not all of the show was interview-based, but most of it. And to really kind of cherry pick 27 people out of that long run and think about what together could make an edited volume that's now the Speaking of Indigenous Politics. It was really great to be able to look at the transcripts of these interviews and think through the multiple dimensions and the people that I interviewed, all that they gave, and that medium of them speaking to a lay audience, a listenership at the time, and now seeing how that translates for a readership. And one of the aims for me in terms of being the host and producer of that show was to do a kind of a work of translation in terms of, if there was a complicated sort of legal case that I had done research on that I was interviewing them about, it gave me a chance to kind of retranslate or restate what they had told me on the interview for a general listening audience and kind of use that as a way to unpack these kind of sometimes complicated legal conundrums and or political cases. And so reading the interviews and selecting what I was going to put in was really a rich process and also gave me a chance to do some light editing where I thought, how do I translate this from a transcript that's been on air where we really know we're being listened to think about how is this reading on the page in terms of those, the kind of mechanics like the paragraph break and taking out the ums and the ahs, but also really kind of thinking about those questions and doing a little bit more streamlining and fine-tuning. I will say, out of the 27 people that I selected to include in the book and people that granted me permission, 3 of those have 2 interviews each, and that's because the show did a follow-up on a particular case study in those 3 cases. It's a really diverse collection in terms of the range of Indigenous political issues, activism, art, legal cases, scholarly work, you name it.
I'm glad you brought up this question of voice and of translating audio into written form, because that's something that I've seen a lot of podcasts do lately and more over the years, and it's really exciting. And it was certainly at the forefront of why I wanted to start this podcast, to kind of foreground the literal voices and bodies of folks that we often only engage with through texts. If we don't engage with them in our local communities, often we encounter these artists or these scholars through the written work. What draws you to that audio format or radio format? What does it let you tell about Indigenous stories and Indigenous politics?
So for me, the answer to that is linked into the politics of independent media and what it meant for me to produce the only show that dealt with Indigenous issues in New England, and to really think of it as a project, an ethical project of being attentive to what was going on at the time during those years in this region. And the subtitle, again, is From Native New England and Beyond. And that beyond opened up sort of, the global scope, but really thinking of all of this as native land, even New England, that's not typically thought of as a native space. And so for part of it is the audio form, but a lot of this is linked into the possibilities and prospects of what independent media can do, whether that's on air or whether that's a podcast like yours, that these are not perspectives that we're going to see in corporate media or in public, what we call public media, like public radio. So for me, the independent radio was the piece, and certainly the audio in terms of actually listening to a conversation and having me be able to sit down and talk to a scholar about a brand new book. And so part of it was thinking about what I wanted to feature and then to really have that conversation and unpack issues in a way that could be thought about as a broad sort of education, if you will, civic education, for lack of a better word. And to me, to go along with the audio is the form of the interview, right? That to me is a very particular genre to have that conversation. And it's an interesting one for me because in general, people that know me socially or have heard me give my own lectures, I'll be described as a talker. But in this context, I'm really the listener. And as I said, kind of a translator of sorts, so that if somebody's using a shorthand that's known in Native America around a particular political status, for example, I didn't want to take it for granted that listeners knew what that person meant, even though I did. So part of it was about, doing a follow-up question where I'm restating and unpacking and then taking it to another level to have another question come. And so I really do like the play on the title of the book of, speaking of Indigenous politics, because it really gets at that issue of the conversation and what that means to be in dialogue with these distinct guests.
So in addition to this collection that you just had come out, you also are the author of another very recent book called Paradoxes of Hawaiian Sovereignty, Land, Sex, and the Colonial Politics of State Nationalism. And that book traces the history of sovereignty debates and struggles in Hawaii. Can you maybe give our listeners a quick overview of what you argue in that book? And then I'd love to dive into some of the specifics.
Sure. Yeah, the book is hot off the press, and it's been a long time coming. It is something that has been a challenge to write. I am affiliated with the Hawaiian nationalist movement, and yet I launched some pretty sustained critiques in this work in relation to the contemporary nationalist movement for Hawaiian sovereignty that could be characterized as being in 2 major camps, and that is people fighting for federal recognition along the lines of what American Indian tribal nations have, those Native nations status under U.S. federal policy on the one hand, and on the other, insisting that the Hawaiian kingdom still exists and we're fighting for the restoration of that independent country. And there are people within the independence camp who see it in different ways. So some would say the kingdom still exists. Actually, it's just that it's occupied by the United States military. And others would say, we have this claim to restore our independence as an independent country because of the illegal occupation, right? You have the U.S. Marines backing white settlers and a U.S. foreign minister in Hawaii in 1893, and then subsequently annexing Hawaii unilaterally through a joint resolution of Congress in 1898. And then you have this fraudulent statehood for Hawaii to become the 50th state in 1959, which was through an internal vote administered by the colonial government. And so those are the two kind of broad strokes of the Hawaiian nationalist movement right now. And what I'm looking at in the book is what I call the paradoxes of Hawaiian sovereignty. What does it mean to have this legal claim to an independence that isn't being realized right now because of U.S. global domination? And then how did Hawaii as an entity or Hawaiian kingdom, how did it get that recognition as an independent state in the 1800s? And what I look at is the politics of land, gender, and sexuality, both then and now. So I look at how when the kingdom was founded by Kamehameha I in 1810, and then it eventually went to his son Kamehameha II, and then the third monarch was Kamehameha III. It's under Kamehameha III that we see the kingdom really leaning towards a westernized model, and that's when land became privatized. That's when Hawaiian women became legally subordinated, and you have a range of legal sanctions or, the criminalization of a range of sexual practices and possibilities. I liken it to what that looked like in the, early to mid 19th century as a form of respectability politics, if you will, because Hawaiians, as a brown Polynesian people, were thought of as savage, childlike, incompetent, had to really prove a sort of a Western likeness to say, no, capable of self-governance, rational, modern. And the questions around land, gender, and sexuality were indices at the time for Western nations of being capable, so that to hold private land was to be considered modern and civilized. Gender egalitarianism, things that Western nations now strive for and call themselves progressive, without patrilineality and patriarchy, Hawaii was seen as backward. What does that mean around same-sex sexual practices, around the mahu category of alternately intersex or transgender, depending on how people are using it today in the 21st century, and also multiple partners for people of all genders, not just men. In some societies, you have multiple partners just for men. What did it mean to try and regulate and eradicate some of those practices? Meant an assault on Indigenous ways of life, especially if you think about the links between land, gender, and sexuality as relationships. What did it mean to convert those relationships into proprietary ones, to transform something like land and homeland and relative into the notion of territory and property? Or think about the legal subsumption of women under their spouses when they became married, this Christian law of coverture. It really is a property model as heterosexual marriage formed within Calvinist constraints in that Christian model. That is about property, or thinking about what it means to engage someone sexually and, people behaving as though they think they own the other person and their sexuality. And so I'm looking at what that meant in the 1800s, and then what does it mean today in terms of the nationalist movement, in terms of how do the politics of land, gender, and sexuality play out in the contemporary nationalist struggle, and how are those issues dealt with differently in these two different camps? And where I come out in the end, and this kind of gets to that argument, is within the federal recognition model, it doesn't deal with that illegality, and it is a sort of subordinate native position, so that it's a recognition of being Indigenous, but as a politically subordinate category. And on the other hand, for the independence activists, there are a lot of people that are really fixated on the fact that we had this independent state, and they reject the language of indigeneity and Indigenous peoples for Kanaka Maoli Native Hawaiians because they understand that Indigenous peoples are politically subordinate under international law as well. And so I'm critiquing both of these movements because they really don't get at a decolonization that's a very robust, porous notion that can really talk about what does it mean to come through this legacy of forms of Christianity and settler colonialism that can't just be remedied by a legal model either way. And so, I stand publicly with Hawaiian independence activists and will always be able to show you in international law that the claim that the U.S. asserts over Hawaii is illegal. That's a fact. But deoccupation alone isn't going to fix things, if you will. And that has to do with settler colonialism and the way that our life practices, our Indigenous lifeways have been transformed. And so in the end, I advocate for a decolonial model that is critical of statist solutions. So it's a bit more of an anarchist bend, if you will. And that has to do with thinking about decolonization beyond just a legal or historical remedy in the service of a new state, like renewing a kingdom as the answer, and or, having a state federally recognized Native governing entity on the other.
One of the things that you talk about quite extensively in the book is the very complicated and often fraught and tense relationship between Native Hawaiians and Native American and other indigenous movements and communities and nations, particularly given the very different and also equally complex histories of U.S. settler colonialism in different locations. I'm curious what changes you've seen in the history of that relationship over time, and maybe where you see or where you hope to see it go in the future.
Yeah, no, thank you. I appreciate that question so much. I mean, there is a long, deep history of Kanaka Maoli, again, that's Native Hawaiian, and Native American solidarity just through multiple epochs and eras that's so important. And then a global solidarity politics with Indigenous peoples all over the world. So Kanaka Maoli have visited Ainu land in Japan and talked about what the Ainu people have faced. Or Sami land, the indigenous place of the Sami people, subject to Scandinavian forms of colonialism. So global indigenous solidarity is really important. I think one of the things that I try to really get at in this book, though, is that when we have state officials pushing the federal recognition model on the Hawaiian people, it has made for a complicated set of politics in terms of Hawaiians committed to independence, rejecting that model, and unfortunately sometimes couching that rejection of that model in a chauvinistic language that actually talks about Native Americans or First Nations peoples as somehow, settling for this lesser model without any real engagement or appreciation or sensitivity to the fact that in so many cases we have a much longer colonial history. So, for example, I'm in Connecticut right now. I'm close to Massachusetts. Thinking about being in one of the states that was one of the original 13 colonies, you have the long, long legacy of British colonialism. And to think about what that means when somebody is engaging English settlers in the 1600s is going to look really different than Captain Cook coming in the late 18th century, and then you have the founding of the kingdom in the early 19th century. It's a different era. It's the era of modern nation states. So unfortunately, some of the language of some of the Hawaiian Kingdom nationalists that I'm critically engaging has been to reject the federal recognition model, and rightly so. This is something that is state-driven. When it did come up from the grassroots in the 80s, the state officials were against it. But when the movement started to turn towards independence, you have state officials really pushing this model as the solution. And I'm against federal recognition in the Hawaiian context. I support it in the context in which I live. I stand with tribes who want federal recognition. That's the part about self-determination. So I don't want to compare. And just to go back to the radio book for a minute, speaking of Indigenous politics, in that critical introduction to those interviews, I have a somewhat substantial section comparing the federal recognition political problem in the Hawaiian context and contrasting it with, say, the Schaghticoke Nation here in Connecticut, where state officials really countered and overturned the Bureau of Indian Affairs' decision to federally recognize the Schaghticoke Indian tribe. And Schaghticoke people fought for that for years. In the Hawaii case, it's state officials that were driving this as a solution, and I think it was the solution to what they saw as a Hawaiian problem. And so you can see I'm trying to be attentive to these, the specifics of location, the specifics of different Indigenous peoples' political genealogies and histories. And so, this is not to say that I think that tribal sovereignty or Indigenous peoples' sovereignty is worth less or is less. The difference is that the U.S. government doesn't recognize Indian tribes' sovereignty as being on par with foreign nations' sovereignty. And that is a different legal genealogy. The problem isn't indigeneity. The problem is violent, oppressive states that want to dominate Indigenous peoples. That's the problem. And so, I'm really trying to open up a space that we all are working for Indigenous futures, a decolonial Indigenous futurity, and that state solutions aren't the answer.
How do you see your work combining your interest in academia or scholarship with your social justice work and your interest in art and creativity and cultural production?
Oh, what a great question. Thank you. For me, they all really feed into each other and they complement each other. So, for example, when I was producing the Indigenous Politics radio show for 7 years, Margot Thomas, who's interviewed in the Indigenous Politics radio book, She and her mother founded an organization, Philippine Apache Women, filing a legal claim against the U.S. Department of Defense, the U.S. Department of Homeland Security, and the U.S. Department of the Interior. That meant that I had to really learn these issues to do interviews responsibly. And to do all that legal research or to keep up with a particular case or to interview somebody about a new book meant I had to read the book. And all of that research for the radio show and my commitment to bringing those perspectives, bringing Indigenous agency, Indigenous sovereignty, Indigenous resistance to a general listenership, all of that research certainly feeds into my own research agenda for my own projects, my own books, and also in the classroom. It keeps me up to date. And so when I'm teaching a class called Indigenous Politics, as I do at Wesleyan, I can say, well, what do I want to feature in this class? This legal case that I've been following for 5 years might be one of them. My courses often influenced what things I would have access to. The interviews and the research would often feed back into my own research and teaching. I also, though, want to highlight the connection ethically, because I right now do work on an anarchist radio program, and I produce it with a working group. We have a majority POC working group. I work with a group of students, and we produce a show together called Anarchy on Air. The anarchist radio show also brings in Indigenous perspective. The kinds of topics that we cover include everything from Palestine solidarity, transgender liberation, sexual freedom, disability rights, you name it. So we have a really broad focus for our show Anarchy on Air, and that's been on air since 2014. And for me, these issues are connected. I mean, some people say, wait, how are you going to anarchism from indigeneity? And I say, well, when we have an anarchist critique of the state and authoritarianism, the state for me is not some abstract thing. It's a settler colonial state. So for me, the connection is about that and identifying and teasing this out, but also, again, from the Indigenous perspective. Statist solutions aren't the answer. States are the problem. They're part of the problem. And so for me, this has to do with consent politics, right? We talk about consent of the governed, or we talk about interpersonal consent in our relationships and being able to do anti-normalization work and refuse when somebody's abusing their power. And that's, to me, the anarchist sensibility is to always challenge power that isn't legitimate. And for me, even with art, the work of anti-normalization is so important. And I think so much of what's going on that's exciting in the art world is work that is really about lifting up the agency of peoples and stories and histories that have been submerged and subordinated.
In addition to this new radio show that you're working on with these students, what other kinds of projects are you up to these days?
In relation to activism, I guess one of the things that I would want to emphasize in this interview is my work in solidarity with Palestinians on BDS, boycott, divestment, and sanctions. I'm finishing up a book on Bds Solidarity Politics, looking at how BDS has played out in very specific Indigenous contexts. So that's a book of political essays, and it's new for me because I'm not aiming for an academic press for that. So, for example, I have an essay on what I've theorized as redwashing, how Israeli officials have courted Indigenous peoples, and what does that mean? And redwashing here is a play on pinkwashing, which is really about how Israel promotes LGBT rights as a way to pinkwash, drawing on the notion of the symbol of the pink triangle. Same with redwashing, and I've done quite a bit of research on that. I have an essay that deals with academic boycott politics within the Native American and Indigenous Studies Association, how that has played out there. And another essay that really brings Hawaii and Palestine into the same frame to look at it as this case that is both occupation and settler colonialism. I'm finishing that up right now, and then I'm working on the next project, which is a spin-off of this second book, Paradoxes of Hawaiian Sovereignty. And that is focus on Native Hawaiian women and the politics of feminism. And part of that project will be looking at Native Hawaiian women who were activists against U.S. annexation and did not want to be part of the U.S. in any way, shape, or form. And some of them who later, once the U.S. took Hawaii, actually advocated for U.S. women's suffrage or for their own suffrage as Native Hawaiian women under the U.S. system. And I'm interested in how they mobilized around suffrage as a way to try and gain back some of their own gendered agency that was not just lost through the U.S. annexation, but even earlier in terms of legal status of Hawaiian women.
So this brings me to my absolute favorite question that I get to ask guests, and I really like rounding out each interview with this. And it gets at the heart of why you do what you do, that big why behind all of these different projects, these activist projects, these academic projects, these artistic or creative projects. And that's that better world that you're working towards. So I'll ask you what might be a giant question and possibly a scary question, as some other guests have mentioned in previous interviews. But I also think it's a question we don't ask enough. of each other, and we don't get enough opportunities to answer. So what kind of world do you want?
I want a demilitarized world. I want a world of environmental sustainability, a world that is not premised or based on proprietary relationships, that we don't own the land, that we don't own other humans, that we don't, engage people sexually as though we own people. So for me, it's really about nothing less than the end of non-consensual domination.
Well, thank you so much for being with us and sharing all of the different ways that you imagine and create otherwise.
Thank you so much for having me on the show. Aloha, Cathy. It's been a pleasure talking with you.
Thanks for listening to another episode of Imagine Otherwise. Imagine Otherwise is produced by Ideas on Fire, and this episode was created by Christopher Persad, Rebecca Reynolds, Michelle Velasquez-Potts, and myself, Cathy Hannabach. You can check out the show notes for this episode on our website at ideasonfire.net, where you can also read about our fabulous guest, as well as find links to the people and projects we discussed on the show.